So we are in Esther chapter 5. As I mentioned, we're going to look at the entire chapter here. I entitled this message, Two Hearts and Two Outcomes, because that's exactly what we see here in this chapter. And as we come to this chapter, you remember, this is really, this chapter here reaches a major turning point. Up until this point, the Jewish people were living under that threat of annihilation because of Haman's evil plot. And back in chapter 3, Haman, remember, convinced the king, Xerxes, to issue a decree, giving him that authority to wipe out all the Jews because of this hatred that he had for Mordecai. And when Mordecai hears this, he is just devastated by this. Remember, it said that he tore his clothes and he mourned in the city square. And in chapter 4, he ends up sending a word to Esther, Queen Esther, urging her to go before the king in order to plead for the people. And at first, Esther, if you remember, she was a little hesitant, knowing that approaching the king in this way without being summoned to the king first could mean that she could be put to death. But Esther, what she does is she moves by faith. And I love what she tells Mordecai. What did she say? Remember, she said, go and gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night and day. And my maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther understood that what she was about to do in approaching the king without being summoned could cost her life. But instead of relying upon her beauty, instead of relying upon her position, she actually humbled herself. We see that. And she sought divine favor and direction before even taking action. And she did this in 3 ways, as I just mentioned. First, she called others to intercede for her, right? She didn't try and face this alone. She invited her people to join her in prayer and in fasting. And I love this about her. She says, I'm going to go for this, but I can't get at this alone. I need your guys' help. This is something bigger than me, and I need help from God. So I want you to join me in that, right? And she invited people to join her in prayer and fasting. The second thing she did is she aligned her will with God's will. Her decision to fast really reflected that. Her heart was ready to obey. And that's what fasting is. She's saying, I'm submitting my will to you. I'm surrendering my desires and what I want. And I'm coming to you before prayer so that I can know your will, God, and how to move forward in that will. And so she aligned her will with God. The third thing she did is she demonstrated a real trust in God. That's faith in action, right? Trust, faith, is a trust in God, and it'll move you. It'll always move you. And her statement, what's her statement? And if I perish, I perish. And when she says this wasn't a hopeless resignation. She wasn't saying, whatever happens, happens. If I die, I die. It wasn't like that. What Esther's saying is, she's saying, I've done everything that I could do to prepare my heart before God, and now I walk forward in faith, and I'm trusting in your providence and your will, God. That's what she means when she says that. And now as we begin chapter 5, the focus shifts from that preparation to that action. In our passage this morning, we learn that faith isn't just about stepping out, but it's also about stepping out in the right way, And that's what she demonstrates for us. She steps out in the right way, with the right heart, with the right spirit, with the right obedience and discernment, and she trusts God for the outcome. And this is exactly what she did, right? And so that's my outline for this morning. We'll see in the beginning of verse 1, that she had the right preparation. We'll see in the second half of verse 1 to verse 3 that she had the right spirit. And verses 4 through 8, we'll see that she had the right obedience and discernment. And then in the remaining verses, in verses 9 through 14, we'll see that she trusted God for the right outcome. That's my outline. But the first thing we see in the first half of verse 4 is that her time of fasting was that she had, right, was directing her. It was leading her, and this was the right preparation. Look at the beginning of verse 1. It says, now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. This third day that's mentioned here is actually referring back to the fasting and the prayer from chapter 4. Remember, they were to fast and pray for 3 days. Esther's courage to do this didn't come from her own power, her own might, right? And her own self-confidence, but this is because of spiritual preparation. She was prepared spiritually. She was confident to go and to even stand before the king because she'd already spent time communing with the King of Kings. That's what happened. She was prepared. She was prepared for this. Now notice it tells us that she put on her royal robes. In the culture, this ancient culture, clothing was very, very important. It not only signified your status, but it was also a way to show rank and actually how you were to be reverent, how people were to have this reverence for you. And by wearing her royal robes, Esther honored the king, and she honored the office that she held. So she was presenting herself properly with a dignity and with a submission to the royal order. That royal robe represented her identity as a queen, the authority and the influence. Remember, who gave it to her? That God gave to her, that God had already given to her. So putting on her royal robes was an act of faith. I believe that Esther also believed the words of Mordecai, that she had been placed in this role by God for such a time as this. So when she puts on her royal robes, she wasn't just getting dressed, she was really stepping into that divine assignment that was given to her by God and confirmed by Mordecai, right? Esther was able to step into her divine assignment because she was prepared. She was prepared by God through that prayer and fasting. And because she was prepared, she had the right spirit. The right spirit. That's my second point. Look at verses 1 and 2. I'm going to read all of verse 1. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house. And while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the interests of the house. And so it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. So interesting, we see this approach now. She's been prepared, right? She's donned her royal robes, and now we see her approach humbly and respectfully. She'd fasted, right? And because of that, her outward beauty, which she was noticed by, right, because of the king or by the king, it matched her inner grace and her inner beauty. And so when the king saw her, I don't believe he was just moved by her looks. He sensed something deeper, something God ordained. And it's interesting, that word favor, I think, plays a crucial role in this, or helps us to interpret it this way. Because that word favor that's being used here was a word used to mean grace, kindness, and acceptance. And it's the same word that we see used throughout Scripture to describe the grace and the favor that comes from God. Isn't that beautiful? So he's saying that he found favor with him. This is something divine that's happening. This grace that he's extending is being extended because God has put this in his heart to do. We see this. Noah found favor by God in Genesis 6. When you get to the New Testament, Mary, in Luke's gospel, Mary found favor, right, by God to bring forth Jesus into this world. And so what this moment shows is that it wasn't about luck. What's taking place isn't about luck, and it was really about grace, God's grace. The favor wasn't just about Esther's appearance or charm. It was evidence that God, his hand was moving in the heart of the king. And I love this about our God, right? Actually, Proverbs 21:1 says this, right? That the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, and he directs it wherever he pleases. And we see this being lived out right here in this passage. Esther prayed, she fasted, she waited, and now God is answering her prayer by turning the king's heart towards her in kindness, right? It said the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. This is beautiful, beautiful. Remember, no one, not even the queen, could enter the king's throne without being, or the throne room without being invited, right? So, and in doing so was an act of death. You were signing your own death warrant by doing that. The king, if he though extended that scepter, right, by doing that, he's saying, he's allowing you. So when the Bible says that the king held out Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, it means that the king had accepted her presence, he had spared her life, and she was granted permission to speak. And in that moment, Esther moved from the threat of death to the assurance of grace and favor. Isn't that beautiful? When I read passages like this, I see the gospel all over it. I see the gospel all over this, right? When I think of her being wearing those robes, and I think of the gospel, how we're robed in righteousness because of Christ Jesus, right? That now we can enter into that throne room, right? Without fear of condemnation because of Jesus Christ. So I see the gospel all over this, and I think it's so beautiful, so beautiful. And so what happens? He extends the scepter. She touches the top of it. She's now accepted in his presence, right? And then the king, in verse 3, he asks her two questions. Okay? The first question is meant to honor her. The second question is meant to bless her. Look at verse 3. He said, and the king said to her, what do you wish? What do you wish, Queen Esther? And what is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom. So the first question he asks is what? What do you wish? What do you wish, Queen Esther? And this question by the king shows that he was pleased in her and pleased to see her. Just the fact that he calls her Queen Esther really reminds everybody that's in the presence of them both, of her royal position. And it shows that the king honors her and has affection towards her. That's what he's doing. He's saying, what is your wish, Queen Esther, right? You are the queen. You are the queen. So he honors her. Then the king asks Esther a second question. He says, what's your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom. Now this phrase, given to you up to half the kingdom, is a royal expression, right, of generosity and favor. I remember I used to hear that and think, man, ask for half of the kingdom. No one ever asked for half the kingdom, you know what I mean? But it's really an expression. It's an expression, right? And it's not meant literally that she can ask up to half the kingdom, but it was a way of saying, ask freely. Ask freely what you desire, and I will give this to you. And so the king's words in verse 3 were really what? An open door for Esther to make her request. Not only has he granted her that, that permission to come to him, now he's saying, whatever you want. He honors her, right, by calling her Queen Esther, but now he says, whatever you want, I will give it to you. This is the moment that they had been praying and fasting for, this very thing. This is answered prayer right now when we read this, right? And this is the moment of opportunity. Yet Esther doesn't rush. She doesn't make her plea known to the king right away. Instead, she demonstrates obedience and discernment and invites the king and Haman to a banquet. And that's the third point. She had this obedience and discernment. Look at verses 4 through 8. So Esther answered, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for him. The king said, bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said. And so the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And at the banquet of wine, the king had said to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. And Esther answered and said, my petition and request is this. If I found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to fulfill my request, well, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king said. So Esther in this first banquet does not reveal her request to the king. Instead, she invites the king and Haman to another banquet, right? Now, when you read this wasn't hesitation. This is really obedience. This is obedience and a trusting in God's plan. What was she doing? She was honoring the king and at the same time allowing God to move. How was Esther being obedient? Well, in ancient Persia, the royal court was known for its formality, for its luxury, and for its very strict etiquette. Important matters were rarely decided or even discussed on the spot. They weren't. And kings often used banquets in settling negotiations, to grant petitions. And it was the way that they demonstrated their royalty. There was a Greek historian, Herodotus. He described the Persian banquets as places where the king would make those decisions, but only after first being honored and entertained. I think that's interesting. I remember watching a documentary one time that one of our presidents, and it slips my mind who it was, he would use Air Force One to do all his negotiations. He would have a diplomat and invite them onto Air Force One, and they would fly. And the reason why, and then he remodeled the office of Air Force One that sat him above the person that he had there, so it was to intimidate. And they wouldn't land until they made a deal. That was the idea, right? And so in this case, they have their own etiquette. And the historian said that they would do this and have these banquets for negotiations and for granting petitions, but only after first being entertained and honored. So the petition was to be requested in multiple banquets, right? The first banquet was given to honor the king. That was the first one, to honor the king. The second banquet would then be used to make the request before the king. Now, this is interesting because it almost, at least I see this, it mirrors the king's etiquette, right? What did he do first? He honored the queen. Come, Queen Esther. And then he says, what's your petition? So it almost mirrors the same type of etiquette that he just displayed. So what is she doing? Esther, if she would have petitioned the king on this first banquet, it would have been very disrespectful. It would have been very. So by waiting for the second banquet, Esther was actually following etiquette. And so from a historical standpoint, the two banquets, they weren't random. They were strategically done, right? This is her wisdom of the Persian royal customs. That's what she's doing. She's operating within their customs in order to fulfill what God has called her to do. And Esther's decision to do that, right, by inviting the king and Haman to this two banquets was a perfect example of being subject to the earthly authority while still remaining faithful to God. That's what she's doing. She's obeying the protocol, the etiquette. She still is queen. And she doesn't have, I was told by the Lord, kick in the door. She didn't go like that. She still obeyed the customs. And it wasn't her a lack of faith. And it even wasn't her not being faithful to God. She was doing something that's biblical. She was subject to those ones that were placed in authority over her, but then she was also being faithful to God. Exactly what we saw with Nehemiah. When you remember when we went through Nehemiah, Nehemiah served under another king, another Persian king, right? But before asking and going to the king to ask to rebuild Jerusalem, what did Nehemiah do? He first prayed, right? And then he waited. He waited for God's timing. And when the opportunity came, he honored the king's position by going to him and speaking respectfully and honored that, right? Even though he knew God was moving him to do what he was going to do, right? And so what happens is that God honored that. He received permission and resources to go fulfill God's plan. We read that in Nehemiah chapter 2. So both Esther and Nehemiah show that faith and submission, they're not opposites. They go together. They go together. And they demonstrate how a believer, how you and I, we can function within human authority and still trust God's higher purpose. God enabled Esther to be obedient and to have that discernment. She was obedient to the earthly king. She respected his authority, understanding that God was sovereign even over his reign, right? That's what she's saying. I can submit to you because I know God is on my side, and no matter what is going to happen, God's going to make it happen, right? And so I can trust this. I can still fulfill this role that God has placed me in and be faithful and trust God in this. Esther respected the king's authority. In 1 Peter 2:17, it tells us to honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. So it doesn't mean that we surrender our devotion to God in order to give devotion to someone else. It means that our devotion to God, right, the way we love God is also displayed in the way we're subject to other people and the way we surrender to other people. It doesn't mean that we exalt anyone above God, right? It doesn't mean that if that authority tells us to do something that goes against God's word, that we just submit to that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about having that respect that God calls us to have, right, in this world. And that's what she does, and I love this. And so she started with that right heart, right, the preparation. And because of that preparation, we see that her spirit is right? She's able to have the right humility. And that led to that obedience and discernment that she was given by God, to not just disregard her role or disrespect the king, but to approach things in a way that was trusting God, but yet honoring that role that God had placed her in. And then lastly, we see Esther's going to trust God for the right outcome. She does all this, and then she says, the rest is up to you. The rest is up to you. And in that outcome, we begin to start to see in verse 9, as Haman begins to, who steps back onto the scene, and also how Haman begins to unravel and his wickedness begins to unravel here. Look at verse 9. It says, so Haman went out that day, joyful and with gladness in his heart, or with glad in his heart, right? And so it's about time this guy's got some joy in him. Haman has just been a bad guy. But he leaves there joyful for the wrong reasons, we'll see, right? But he left that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when he saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. So at first, he leaves with this joy, right? But that joy was because of a pride that he still had, the pride within him. He was personally invited by the queen to dine with the king. He had some type of importance, right? Power. But the joy quickly turned to anger when he sees Mordecai sitting at the king's gate, refusing to stand, refusing to show him any respect. And Haman's pride is so great that even after being honored the way he did publicly, he can't even enjoy it because Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. He can't even do that. His emotions move quickly from joy to rage because he had a pride that made him unstable, because that's what pride does. It makes us unstable. It stirs up strife in our heart. That's what it does. Actually, Proverbs 25 tells us that. He who's of a prideful heart stirs up strife, but he who trusts in the Lord will be prospered. So what does he do? He gets upset. He's upset. Nevertheless, in verse 10, it says, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife, Zeresh. And then Haman told them of his great riches and the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she had prepared. And tomorrow I'm again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Isn't that crazy? Now, even though it says he restrained himself, in reality, he's burning inside with bitterness and with rage and with anger and pride, right? His actions show us the difference between suppressing anger and surrendering anger to God, as we talked about, right? Instead of surrendering it, he's suppressing it. And when we suppress it, it always leads to sin, right? It'll always lead to sin. But when we surrender to God, it always leads to peace and forgiveness, right? He goes home, what does he do? He gathers his friends, his wife, and he begins to boast about all his accomplishments, about his wealth, about his influence. He says, I got everything. He brags that Queen Esther invited no one but him to the banquet, right? He's like, you guys, gather together. I'm going to tell you how good I am and how wonderful I am. And we see this is pride in its purest form here. In verse 13, we see that his pride poisoned his heart and stole his peace. It says, yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. His heart's fully revealed in this moment, right? No amount of wealth, no amount of success or attention can satisfy him because of his pride. Even though he has power, riches, honor, none of it brings him peace. And that's what pride does. It always leaves us empty because it demands constant recognition. Constant recognition. His pride led to this hatred for Mordecai that consumes everything in his life. And it's this pride and hatred that blinds him to reason and really sets the stage for his downfall. We'll see this. Unfortunately, though Haman returned home and surrounded himself with friends and family, instead of finding a wise counsel at home, what does he do? He finds people that are just going to fuel the fire, right? People that are going to feed his pride. It's at that moment that pride and bitterness, that is his downfall begins. This is where it begins. In verse 4, verse 14, the advice he receives will push him from anger to action, and it's going to push him that pride to that plotting evil again. He's going to go back into plotting mode. That's what he's going to do. Look at verse 14. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let all gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And this thing pleased Haman, and so he had the gallows made. So they give him terrible advice. Terrible advice. By the way, never ever get advice from unbelievers, not pertaining to biblical things. Never. It just don't go. They could be the wisest person in the world, but we learned Monday or Wednesday in our Bible study, right, that the unspiritual cannot guide the spiritual. They just can't. They don't know the things of God, and so they cannot guide the spiritual. And so here's a classic example, not that Haman was spiritual in any way, right? But But he goes there, and what do? They just give him bad advice, terrible advice. Instead of calming his anger, helping him to see his pride, they encouraged him in this hatred that he had. What do they suggest? Build a gallows, right? Build a gallows, massive wooden gallows, 50 cubits high, right? Roughly about 75 feet high. And what are they doing it to make an example out of Mordecai? These gallows, I think sometimes when people think of gallows, at least when I do, I think of like the Western gallows, where they hang them and drop the trap door out and they fall. These are big wooden posts. So this is execution by impalement. So imagine this. If they would have followed through with this, there's this huge 75-foot spike or post with Mordecai impaled on top of it. This is horrendous. When you think about it, it's not just killing Mordecai. It's meant to publicly humiliate him, and it's also meant to terrorize the rest of the Jewish people. So there's evil intent here, what's happening. And it said that it pleased him. It pleased him, and so he had the gallows made. It's crazy. So as we close this chapter, we're left standing between two very different examples, right? Esther and Haman. Both had influence, both had access to the king, both were given a moment to make a good decision, a moment in history to make a decision. But how they handled their moments revealed the true conditions of their heart. Esther stands as a picture of faith. One who has faith under pressure, one who trusts God and prepared to meet the moment that God had ordained for her. She didn't act out of impulse, right? She wasn't fearful in a way. I mean, at first she was a little fearful, but she didn't act in fear. She was prepared because she prepared her heart before the Lord. And she moved with humility and with grace and with discernment. And she trusted that God, her God who had brought her to this moment, that he would see her through this. And because she walked in obedience and faith, God's providence began to unfold in a way that no one could even predict or even orchestrate it. Haman, on the other hand, he's a sobering reminder and a warning of what happens when pride rules our heart. He lived for recognition. He demanded respect. He craved control. And even when he had everything, wealth, power, position, and favor, he was empty. Nothing satisfied him. And this is because pride never has enough. And pride is never, ever content. And so what do we leave with here in this message? What I leave with is that we don't have to force our way into God's plan. We just need to trust him and follow his lead moment by moment. Moment by moment. And I'll tell you this, at least in my experience, he doesn't lay out these grand plans very often in front of you, right? We pray for those. Lord, just show me how everything's going to happen, each step, how it's going to end. Show me everything. And we'll pray and we'll pray. And God will still require us to trust him moment by moment, step by step, right? And so we need to do this. That God does have a plan. He is working in our midst. He does have a purpose for your life. He does have moments in your life and in my life where divine moments where we're going to be able to stand for him, where we're going to be able to live for him, where we're going to be able to act in such a way to bring him glory and to be a witness for him. And even though some of those moments are even going to be scary, but we can trust him moment by moment. And sometimes it looks scary and I say, God, at least show me the escape plan, right? At least show me plan B or the escape plan. And he says, I want you to trust me. Do you trust me? And we have to get to that place where we say, Lord, if I perish, I perish. I'm going to trust you in this because you've never not been faithful. And I know you're not going to begin today. Because every day I look up at these skies, I see that you're at work everywhere. The very creation that I witness, the very rain that we see this morning, God brought that for us, for this earth. Wow, how horrible, right? To flood our streets. Think of all the animals in the mountains that are getting water today and all the plants. Think about how God knows. This may not benefit us here when we see our parking lots or our streets flooded, but there's a purpose in all of that. So even though it's an inconvenience right now, I can say, Lord, I still trust you in this. Even the rain today, I trust you in. I trust you in that. And so by moment, we walk trusting him. And that's what faith looks like. It's trusting him even when we can't see what God is doing, right? He's already gone before us. He's already arranging every detail for his glory and for our good. And so that's what I believe we leave with again. Do we trust him? Do we trust him? Next week, we're going to move into chapter 6, and the story is going to take another dramatic turn. This is a crazy story. It's an amazing story. And we'll see this dramatic turn because the king's going to have a sleepless night. And in that sleepless night, right, God is going to intervene in the story again. And while Haman is plotting Mordecai's death, God will be working in this sleepless night. And the same God that moved the king to extend his scepter towards Esther will now move the same king to open a book. He's going to open a book, and what he reads will begin to unravel Haman's plan and exalt God's servant Mordecai. And that's what we get to look forward to next week. What a drastic contrast between two people. Drastic contrast, right? What do we get to do? We get to be faithful. That's what we get to do. We get to be faithful. And the reason why we get to be faithful is because of Jesus. Because of Jesus. Because before Jesus, we were condemned. We were dead in our trespasses and our sins. Right? That means that each step we took was one step closer to condemnation, to eternal judgment, to eternal separation from God. But because of God's great love, because of his great love, he sent Jesus to us, who humbled himself and who went to the cross and who redeemed us with his blood so that we get now to have faith, so that we can trust in him and walk in him, so we can be used by him. This is one of the greatest, this is a good story. Our salvation is the greatest story ever told of Jesus coming, right? And that's what we get to participate in. So excited to see how this all unfolds. We'll see the dramatic turn next week. Until then, stay tuned. We'll be back, same Revive time, same Revive channel.